Helen had always been a quiet presence in her own life, the kind of woman whose existence was defined not by dramatic gestures or public recognition, but by the steady, unwavering care she gave to her family. Her days in Vermont had been simple and unassuming, spent tending to her children, supporting her husband in his quiet pursuits, and nurturing a home that, though modest, was filled with warmth and laughter. The rolling hills and thick forests surrounding her small town mirrored her own sense of calm. A life lived slowly, deliberately, in harmony with the natural world. Despite the simplicity, or perhaps because of it, Helen had cultivated a deep sense of pride in her life's accomplishments. She had raised children who were kind, curious, and well-mannered, and she had maintained a marriage built on mutual respect and understated affection. Yet, as much as she cherished her own world, she could not deny a persistent longing to bridge the gap between herself and her wealthy brother. Her brother had always lived in a different orbit, one colored by affluence, social expectation, and a certain polish that Helen found fascinating and intimidating in equal measure. He had married into wealth early, or perhaps inherited it, and had surrounded himself with people whose lives moved quickly and luxuriously. For Helen, family had been a sanctuary, but she wondered if it had also been a form of limitation, a quiet existence that had shielded her from the dazzling, if superficial, world that her brother inhabited. When she received the invitation to his engagement party, she felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety. The event promised a chance, however fleeting, to step into her brother's world and perhaps to be seen not merely as the quiet sister from Vermont, but as someone capable, engaging, and worthy of respect in a sphere she had only ever observed from the outside. In preparing for the party, Helen approached every detail with care. She chose her clothing thoughtfully, favoring attire that was elegant yet understated, reflecting her own personality rather than attempting to mimic the flamboyant tastes she associated with her brother's social circle. She worried less about appearances than about the impression her children would make. She had raised them to be polite, inquisitive, and observant, and she hoped that these qualities would speak for themselves, demonstrating that the quiet life they led had not deprived them of grace, charm, or intelligence. Packing their bags, she reminded herself that this was not a contest of wealth or style, but a moment to connect, to be present in a way that mattered to her, even if the social currents were unfamiliar and intimidating. On the day of the party, the drive to her brother's home offered a mixture of anticipation and reflection. The landscape gradually shifted from the familiar greenery of Vermont to the manicured elegance of her brother's neighborhood. She observed the grand houses, immaculate gardens, and polished cars with a sense of quiet awe, feeling both a thrill and a subtle pang of inadequacy. This was a world that operated according to different rules, a society where wealth and status were visible in every detail, from the architecture to the carefully curated appearances of the guests. Helen could not help but feel the contrast between their lives and her own, and yet she clung to the hope that sincerity, kindness, and authenticity could bridge the gap in ways that money and prestige could not. Arriving at the house, Helen was struck first by the sheer scale of it. The mansion was more magnificent than she had imagined, with towering windows, gleaming floors, and a sense of space that seemed almost alien to her Vermont home. She took a deep breath and gathered her children, encouraging them to smile, to be polite, and to engage with the other guests. Her own nerves were tempered by the desire to be a steady presence for her children, to guide them through this unfamiliar terrain with confidence and composure. She reminded herself that this gathering was a celebration, an opportunity to witness the happiness of her brother as he embarked on a new chapter of life. Despite the beauty of the house and the apparent joy of the occasion, Helen could feel the subtle undercurrents of tension and expectation. She was attuned to the nuances of body language, the slight smiles that masked judgment, the whispered comments that suggested comparisons she was unsure how to navigate. Yet she refused to let anxiety dominate her experience. She engaged in conversation where she could, listened attentively, and allowed herself moments of genuine curiosity about her brother's fiancé and the life she had built around her. Helen's hope was simple, that in showing herself and her children with honesty, warmth, and dignity, they could be embraced rather than scrutinized, celebrated rather than mocked. As Helen moved through the rooms of the grand house, she carried with her the essence of her Vermont life: quiet strength, familial devotion, and an unwavering sense of integrity. She understood that she was an outsider in this world of wealth and polished social rituals. Yet she also knew that her presence, grounded in authenticity, had its own value. With each interaction, she quietly measured the responses of those around her, gauging whether the warmth she offered could be reciprocated, and whether her family could navigate this unfamiliar environment without losing themselves in the process. This delicate balance between anticipation, anxiety, and hope defined Helen's experience as she stepped fully into her brother's world, carrying the weight of her own expectations alongside the love and protection she felt for her children. The engagement party unfolded in a manner that immediately highlighted the stark contrast between Helen's world and the polished, high society sphere her brother inhabited. From the moment they stepped through the grand double doors, the air seemed charged with a delicate tension, a mix of celebration and subtle scrutiny. Guests moved through the expansive rooms with practiced ease, holding glasses of champagne and exchanging laughter that was just a shade too measured, smiles that seemed rehearsed, and conversations that hinted at underlying social hierarchies. Helen, accustomed to the warmth and spontaneity of her own home, felt an almost tangible difference in the atmosphere. Every gesture, every word seemed laden with expectation, and she could not help but notice how her family, modest and straightforward, appeared under the magnifying glass of this environment. Her children, who had been playful and confident in Vermont, suddenly seemed smaller, quieter, as if sensing the unspoken evaluations around them. Helen tried to encourage them, reminding them to smile and to introduce themselves politely, but even their best efforts seemed to attract attention in the wrong way. A fleeting glance from a guest, a whisper that stopped abruptly when they approached, suggested that her family's simplicity was being read not as charm, but as something to be judged. Helen felt a sharp pang of protectiveness, a desire to shield her children from the subtle barbs and the quiet condescension that lingered beneath the surface. She understood instinctively that in this world, appearances mattered more than sincerity, and yet she was determined not to allow the artificiality of the occasion to undermine the values she had instilled in her children. As the evening progressed, Helen attempted to navigate the social currents with as much grace as she could muster. She engaged in polite conversation with acquaintances she barely recognized, offering gentle smiles and listening attentively. Her husband, quiet and unassuming as always, supported her in subtle ways, interjecting when appropriate with thoughtful observations that hinted at depth beyond his modest exterior. Helen hoped that his presence, calm and composed, would lend them some credibility in the eyes of the other guests. Yet despite their best efforts, the nuances of this society were difficult to master. Every joke seemed layered with irony. Every compliment carried an undercurrent of evaluation. Her children, too young to fully grasp these subtleties, occasionally faltered, their innocence becoming a point of amusement rather than admiration. The future sister-in-law quickly revealed herself as the focal point of social scrutiny. She moved through the room with a confidence that bordered on imperious, her every gesture calculated to impress and assert dominance. Helen observed how she directed attention, subtly diminishing others while elevating herself, and felt a growing tension that was impossible to ignore. The fiancé's eyes, sharp and appraising, occasionally flicked toward Helen and her family, and Helen could sense the quiet judgments being made about their appearance, behavior, and social standing. Her children, once playful, now clung subtly to her side, sensing the shift in atmosphere and responding instinctively to the unspoken hierarchies of the party. Helen, however, kept her composure, determined not to show discomfort or allow the situation to erode the sense of self-respect she had cultivated in her family. Despite the underlying tension, there were moments when Helen tried to focus on the purpose of the evening, a celebration of her brother and the new chapter he was entering. She watched him with a mix of pride and melancholy, noting how seamlessly he navigated this world, how comfortable he seemed in a society that often felt alien to her. She longed for the evening to be a bridge, a moment when her family could be accepted and admired rather than scrutinized. Small gestures, a polite conversation with a guest, an attempt to engage in the party games, a quiet compliment from one of the attendants offered glimmers of hope. Yet these moments were fleeting, often overshadowed by the subtle mockery or dismissive comments that pervaded the room. Helen's awareness of the social landscape sharpened as the party continued. She noted who held influence, how attention was directed, and how the future sister-in-law subtly orchestrated interactions to emphasize superiority. The laughter of some guests, polite and restrained, often masked amusement at Helen's family rather than genuine interest. She sensed the complex dance of power, status, and social maneuvering at play, and realized that navigating it required a careful balance of patience, observation, and quiet self-assurance. Her children, though innocent and unassuming, were learning lessons in social awareness more quickly than she anticipated, observing the subtle dynamics and sensing the difference between inclusion and exclusion. Through it all, Helen remained steadfast, committed to her own values and the dignity of her family. She understood that they were outsiders in this world of polished appearances, but she refused to let that diminish their sense of self. She smiled when appropriate, engaged in conversation where possible, and observed with a quiet intensity, all while shielding her children from the sting of judgment as best she could. The engagement party, for all its grandeur and sophistication, became a test of resilience, poise, and the ability to navigate a world that valued surface over substance. In those hours, Helen's quiet strength and careful observation defined the experience, setting the stage for the deeper revelations and emotional challenges that would come later in the evening. As the evening unfolded, the tension in the air began to crystallize, shifting from subtle glances and whispered comments into moments that were impossible to ignore. Helen had managed to maintain her composure throughout the early stages of the engagement party, guiding her children gently through unfamiliar social territory, smiling when appropriate, and engaging in conversation that was polite and measured. Yet, beneath her calm exterior, a growing unease simmered. She sensed that her presence, along with that of her family, had become the subject of scrutiny in ways that were neither incidental nor kind. Her children, usually confident and spirited, had grown quieter, their smiles a little more tentative, their steps a little more cautious. The atmosphere had shifted, and Helen could feel that a confrontation, or at least a moment of judgment, was imminent. It came in the form of the future sister-in-law, whose confidence had, until now, been a subtle force, influencing the flow of conversation and the distribution of attention in the room. She approached Helen and her family with a smile that did not reach her eyes, a smile carefully crafted to seem warm while carrying an unmistakable undercurrent of superiority. The words that followed, though polite on the surface, carried a sting that was impossible to overlook. Comments about Helen's children, innocuous in tone to the untrained ear, were laced with judgment and condescension. The fiancé remarked on their clothing, their manners, their Vermont upbringing, all in a way that suggested amusement rather than genuine curiosity. Each statement was calculated, each smile strategically timed, and Helen felt the sharp edges of humiliation cutting closer with every syllable. Helen tried to respond with grace, maintaining a calm demeanor as she offered polite replies and encouraging nods to her children, urging them to remain poised. She had always prided herself on her ability to navigate difficult situations with composure, on her capacity to shield her loved ones from the harshness of the world. Yet in this moment, the subtle cruelty of the fiancé, combined with the attentive eyes of the other guests, created a pressure that was almost unbearable. Her heart pounded with a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and a protective instinct that demanded she defend her children without escalating the situation. She realized that in this social arena, dignity and restraint were as important as truth and self-respect, and she struggled to balance both. The humiliation became more pronounced when the fiancé, perhaps sensing the impact of her words, escalated the subtle mockery into something more direct. A comment about Helen's own life, framed as casual curiosity, was delivered with an unmistakable edge, highlighting perceived deficiencies in her career, her home, and her demeanor. The laughter that followed, though polite to those unobservant, was aimed squarely at Helen and her family. She felt a flush rise to her cheeks, a heat of embarrassment that was compounded by the awareness that her children were watching closely. Their own reactions caught between confusion and discomfort. Every instinct in Helen urged her to retreat, to remove her family from the judgmental eyes of the room. Yet she held her ground, determined to demonstrate strength in the face of social cruelty. As the evening continued, the humiliation was amplified by the reactions of the other guests. Some looked away awkwardly, uncertain of how to respond, while others allowed subtle smirks or whispered comments to pass without intervention. Helen noted the social dynamics at play, the way status and wealth shaped responses, the unspoken rules that governed who could speak freely and who had to endure silently. She understood that her family, with their modest background and unassuming demeanor, was being positioned as an object lesson, a contrast meant to highlight the sophistication and refinement of those around them. It was a realization that was painful yet clarifying. This environment did not operate on the values she held dear, and the rules of engagement were dictated by a hierarchy that was invisible but deeply felt. Through it all, Helen's internal struggle was profound. She oscillated between the desire to confront the fiancé directly and the need to maintain a composed, dignified presence for her children. She reminded herself that her response, measured and deliberate, would teach more than anger or retaliation ever could. She smiled politely, offered calm responses, and sought to redirect attention to neutral topics when possible, all while absorbing the sting of humiliation with quiet fortitude. Every moment was a test of her resilience, an exercise in balancing vulnerability and strength, and an opportunity to demonstrate to her children the power of grace under pressure. By the time the direct confrontation subsided, Helen had endured an emotional gauntlet. The fiancé's subtle dominance had been established. The laughter of the room had reinforced the hierarchy, and yet Helen's quiet strength had remained intact. Her children, though shaken, had observed the demonstration of resilience, and her husband's supportive presence had been a source of quiet reassurance. In that crucible of social tension, Helen realized something fundamental. That dignity was not granted by wealth, approval, or external recognition, but by the courage to remain true to oneself and to protect those one loves, even when the world seemed determined to undermine them. The humiliation, sharp and immediate as it had been, also served as a mirror, reflecting the values and priorities that defined her life and those she wished to pass on to her children. As the evening progressed, Helen's awareness of her surroundings deepened, and she began to notice subtleties she had missed upon first entering the grand house. The initial focus on social niceties, polite introductions, and careful conversation gradually gave way to a creeping sense that the world around her was not as it seemed. The laughter that had once sounded warm now carried undertones of calculation. The smiles she received seemed increasingly rehearsed, and every gesture, from the placement of drinks to the timing of glances, hinted at a carefully orchestrated performance. Helen had long understood that wealth and status created a distinct social language, but she had not anticipated the degree to which appearances could conceal realities. The house, with its opulent chandeliers, polished floors, and elegant furnishings, seemed almost to breathe a quiet authority, asserting dominance and control over everyone within it. And yet, as she observed the interactions around her, she began to sense that this display of perfection masked deeper truths, secrets waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. Her attention was first drawn to her husband, who until now had seemed quietly supportive, almost unremarkable in the eyes of the other guests. Helen had always admired his calm demeanor, his thoughtful presence, and the subtle ways he brought balance to their family life. He had never sought attention or acclaim, content instead to pursue his work as a nature writer and to live a life grounded in the rhythms of their Vermont home. Yet, as she watched him converse with her brother-esque guests, she began to notice flashes of knowledge, of insight, and of connections that she had never fully appreciated before. A comment here, a pointed observation there, revealed a depth of understanding and influence that she had never associated with the quiet man she thought she knew. There was a sophistication, an understated intelligence, and perhaps even a degree of power in her husband's interactions that went unnoticed by most, yet could not be ignored once observed. The realization struck Helen gradually, a quiet but persistent awareness that her husband was not the man she had assumed him to be. His unassuming nature had concealed layers of experience, connections, and insight that were now beginning to surface in subtle ways. The conversations he navigated, the respect he elicited without effort, and the attention that even the fiancé occasionally afforded him hinted at a past, or perhaps a present, that she had never glimpsed. It was not just a matter of intellectual depth. It was a recognition that her life with him had been intertwined with hidden strengths and hidden histories. Helen felt a mix of awe, confusion, and a twinge of apprehension. The man she thought she knew intimately now seemed both familiar and strangely distant, revealing a dimension of complexity that reshaped her understanding of their life together. Simultaneously, Helen's perception of the house itself began to shift. The opulent surroundings, initially impressive, now carried a sense of mystery, as though the walls themselves held secrets waiting to be uncovered. Conversations overheard in passing hinted at ownership and family connections that contradicted what she had assumed. She realized that this house, so grand and seemingly a testament to her brother's wealth, was not as straightforwardly his as she had believed. There were nuances in the way guests referred to the property, subtle implications that suggested layers of legal, familial, or social complexity. Helen could feel a growing awareness that the physical space in which she had been walking with a sense of tentative confidence was entwined with histories and relationships she had not anticipated, and that these hidden elements might influence the evening in ways she could not yet predict. This awareness deepened as Helen observed the interactions between her brother, his fiancée, and the other guests. Patterns emerged that hinted at alliances, unspoken tensions, and strategic behaviors that shaped the flow of the party. The facade of effortless wealth and civility began to crumble, revealing a network of subtle manipulations and private knowledge that Helen's family, with all their honesty and simplicity, could not have anticipated. She recognized that the evening was no longer merely a celebration. It had become a stage where hidden truths were carefully concealed, where perceptions were managed, and where the stakes extended far beyond polite conversation. Helen's internal response was complex, a mixture of curiosity, caution, and a renewed determination to protect her children. She realized that the assumptions she had made about her husband and the house were incomplete, and that navigating the remainder of the evening would require heightened awareness. The quiet man she had known was, in fact, a figure of subtle influence, and the house, more than just a backdrop for her brother's engagement, was a locus of secrets with potential consequences she had yet to understand. As the night wore on, Helen found herself reconciling the familiar warmth of her family's values with the intricate, sometimes harsh realities of this unfamiliar world, preparing herself for revelations that would challenge her perception of both people and place. By the time the party reached its midpoint, Helen had come to a profound understanding. Appearances were not to be trusted, and every person, every space, carried layers of hidden meaning. The quiet confidence of her husband, the opulence of the house, and the meticulous orchestration of social interactions all pointed to a deeper truth, one that demanded careful observation, patience, and the courage to navigate complexities she had only begun to glimpse. It was a realization that would shape her actions and decisions for the remainder of the evening, as she confronted not just the judgments of others, but the hidden realities that lay beneath the glittering surface of her brother's world. As the evening drew toward its climax, the tension that had been simmering beneath polite conversation and measured smiles began to coalesce into moments of undeniable emotional intensity. Helen, having navigated the subtle judgments, mockery, and carefully concealed truths of the engagement party, now faced the culmination of an experience that had tested her resilience, her composure, and her understanding of both family and society. The grandeur of the house, the orchestrated social hierarchy, and the intricate dance of appearances had all shaped the night. But the ultimate revelation lay not in the wealth or the elegance surrounding her, but in the deeper truths about connection, dignity, and the strength of her own family. The fiancé, who had wielded her social confidence like a weapon, continued to assert her dominance in subtle ways, drawing attention to herself while diminishing the presence of others. Helen felt the weight of scrutiny press upon her and her children, each comment, glance, and whispered remark reinforcing the contrast between the carefully curated sophistication of the wealthy guests and the quiet authenticity of her own family. Yet amidst the humiliation and discomfort, Helen began to see the power of resilience in action, not just in herself, but in her children. They observed, absorbed, and learned, their innocence tempered by the recognition that the world was often less about fairness and more about perception. Their quiet dignity, maintained even under the gaze of judgment, became a source of pride for Helen, a confirmation that the values she had instilled were both enduring and unshakable. The climax of the evening arrived when the subtle dynamics could no longer remain beneath the surface. A series of interactions, some inadvertent, some deliberate, brought the underlying tensions into sharper focus. Guests shifted, conversations paused, and Helen became acutely aware of the eyes upon her. The delicate balance of appearances was challenged, and in that suspended moment, the truth of her family's character shone through, while the fiancé attempted to reinforce her social superiority. The quiet confidence of Helen and her husband, paired with the composed reactions of their children, disrupted the carefully maintained hierarchy. The party, once dominated by a superficial sense of elegance, now bore witness to a different kind of sophistication, one rooted not in wealth or performance, but in authenticity, integrity, and resilience. Helen's own awareness of her husband's hidden depths became increasingly clear at this critical juncture. His quiet intelligence, previously masked by modesty, now revealed itself in the way he engaged with the situation, offering measured observations and subtle interventions that diffused tension without sacrificing dignity. Helen recognized that his presence was not merely supportive, but transformative, shaping the emotional landscape of the party in ways that demanded acknowledgement. The combination of his understated authority and her family's unwavering integrity created a counterbalance to the orchestrated social hierarchy, demonstrating that influence and respect were not confined to wealth or status. In that moment, Helen felt a profound sense of partnership and connection, a realization that their shared life had been richer, in ways not measured by money or social standing, than the world around them could comprehend. The house itself, once an intimidating symbol of wealth and power, took on a different significance. Helen began to understand that, while appearances had their place, the true measure of the evening, and indeed of life, lay not in the grandeur of surroundings, but in the strength of the bonds shared within them. The walls that had seemed so imposing earlier now framed a stage for revelation, growth, and understanding. Observing her children navigate the complex social environment with curiosity and resilience, Helen felt a renewed sense of purpose, that the lessons of humility, patience, and self-respect she had cultivated in Vermont had prepared them to confront the world with courage and grace. By the conclusion of the party, the dynamic had shifted. The subtle mockery of the fiancé, the carefully orchestrated attention of the guests, and the illusions of social superiority had all been countered not with confrontation, but with quiet strength and dignity. Helen's family had endured scrutiny, humiliation, and the unsettling revelation of hidden truths, yet they emerged intact, unified, and self-assured. The experience had illuminated the difference between superficial appearances and substantive character, highlighting the enduring power of authenticity over performance. The lessons learned in those hours would resonate far beyond the walls of the house, shaping the family's understanding of themselves, each other, and the world they inhabited. As they prepared to leave, Helen reflected on the night with a mixture of relief and satisfaction. The engagement party had tested them in ways she could never have anticipated, yet it had also affirmed the values she held most dear. Wealth, status, and appearances could impress and intimidate, but they could not erode the foundations of love, integrity, and resilience that defined her family. In navigating the social labyrinth of the evening, Helen had discovered a quiet triumph. That dignity, courage, and the strength of family bonds were more powerful than any display of opulence, more enduring than any calculated judgment, and ultimately, more revealing of true worth than the most polished of social facades.